and excited to be here today. Honored to be your program moderator. This is the fourth year that Generations United, we will be tweeting live today, and we encourage you to join in using hashtag #AllGenerations. This is the fourth year that Generations United has issued what we call our signature report, a report with recommendations on a significant issue viewed through an intergenerational lens. In other words, a lens that views all generations as assets to each other and to our community. Last year, we examined how Americans thought our country was doing in meeting hunger and nutritional needs for both younger and older people. This year, we're honored to partner with the Generations Initiative and focus on demographic transformation that is pushing our country's founding narrative, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And that leads to our report title, Out of Many, One, Uniting the Changing Faces of America. The report reflects Harris Interactive poll data, which has been commissioned by both Generations United and the Generation Initiative. It explores how Americans of all generations feel about the changing makeup of our society. It highlights the mutual bond support between increasingly diverse age groups. It focuses on transportation, housing, work, and civic engagement through an intergenerational lens that strengthens our families, our communities, and our economy. And last, it lays out recommendations for policymakers, business and community leaders, and advocates. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the funders of our program today. W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Atlantic Philanthropies, Annie E. Casey Foundation, Ford Foundation, Lumina Foundation, MetLife Foundation, the Verizon Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Sodexo Foundation. Without these folks, we wouldn't be able to deliver the message that we're delivering today. So we really do thank these companies and organizations for their contributions. Now I'm privileged to introduce Donna Butts, Generations United Executive Director, and Hillary Pennington, the Director of the Generations Initiative. These ladies will review the report findings today. Before I bring them up, I'd like to say a few things about these two ladies. Donna has spent more than 35 years in the nonprofit sector, primarily working on or behalf of teenagers before moving into the intergenerational arena. She's been leading Generations United for some 16 years. And in that role, she's advocated for investments in grand families. She's challenged single-age communities and facilities and promoted the belief that our communities are stronger and healthier when the policies and practices connect our generations. Recently, the nonprofit Times named her among its Power and Influence Top 50 for the second year in a row. Just as influential, Hillary Pennington, is the Director of Generation Initiative and the new Vice President for Education, Creativity, and Free Expression at the Ford Foundation. In her 22 years as President and CEO of Jobs for the Future, she helped the research and policy development organization she co-founded become a leader on issues of education, youth transitions, workforce development, and future work requirements. After 6 years as Director of Education, Post-Secondary Success, and Special Initiatives at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, she founded the Generations Initiative to develop effective responses to the challenges and opportunities of the dramatic demographic shifts occurring in the U.S. Please welcome Donna and Hillary.
Thank you, Walter. I think you might be a little taller than me. Hillary and I decided that because we had a little flexibility today, that rather than have to stand behind the other person like the wife of the guilty politician, that we would make our remarks separately, that we had time to do that. But I do have to say that it has been an absolutely fabulous partnership. I feel like we couldn't have worked with a better couple of people in the Generations Initiative, and in particular, Hillary and Chelsea. And one of the wonderful things about working on this project together is that both of our organizations had time when we were just under a lot of stress, a lot of deadlines, and we carried each other during those times. So to me, our partnership has really been a wonderful example of how we are stronger together when we work together on a goal and have a vision that's similar. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you. I want to thank all of you, too, for coming here today. We were telling people that we were oversubscribed, but you're all lucky because of the weather. You have the prime seats, a great vantage point, and get to really enjoy this session today. So thank you very, very much for being with us. Today, I think most of you are well aware that today, not the most significant event isn't necessarily the snow or the fact that we're releasing this report, but that the world is honoring a particularly wonderful, wonderful world leader, Nelson Mandela, who was, and providing an inspirational, emotional, and very, very important tribute to a very, very important man who understood the concept of unity and what that means to our civil society. What you may not realize is that it was 20 years ago today that Nelson Mandela received the Nobel Peace Prize. So not only is he being honored worldwide today, it was 20 years ago that he received the Peace Prize because of what he did to unify a country and a people. When he got that prize, what he said was, "We devote what remains of our lives to the use of our country's unique and painful experience to demonstrate in practice that the normal condition for human existence is democracy, justice, peace, non-racism, non-sexism, prosperity for everybody, a healthy environment and equality, and solidarity among the peoples." As he demonstrated when he founded the Elders on his 89th birthday, this includes intergenerational solidarity. Our report today that we're issuing today uses an intergenerational lens to explore the fact that right now there's an underlying fear that we're in a zero-sum game, a struggle for jobs and resources that divides older and younger generations and threatens solidarity amongst the generations and among people. While there are differences in both younger and older voters, their ideas of family and success, the intergenerational bonds are positive sum, not negative sum. As our report shows, our demographic diversity in both age and race is our greatest asset. Every generation is part of the future. Now, what we found when we conducted the Harris survey is that 84% of respondents had noticed a change in demographics in their communities. They were aware that things were changing. And while the majority of Americans, 66%, agreed that they're optimistic about the changes, younger and older are most likely to feel positive about new neighbors, 43%. And they also believe that communities are the best place and the best prepared to deal with the changes, far more than employers or elected officials. That's a testament to the confidence that Americans have in what they can achieve and accomplish in their communities at the local level. Now, younger and older are also aligned in belief that publicly funded programs targeted to specific age groups like K through 12 education or Social Security are not burdensome responsibilities, but investments that benefit all generations. They realize that people live in families, that they care about one another and they care about their neighbors. That doesn't mean that we're not facing some very difficult prospects, some very difficult work that needs to be done. But what people think about is, in fact, that they're investments in across the lifespan, and those are investments in the future. Yet our programs and policies are increasingly siloed and segregated by age, and that prevents older people from using what we call the grandparent advantage, that passing on of knowledge, of wisdom, of hope for the future, of what they've learned to young people. And it keeps young people from realizing the depth and length of their life from the service that they can provide now. As somebody told me after September 11th, most people turn to somebody older to know that life goes on. So there's that wisdom and that recycling of human capital and engagement of human capital that makes us a much stronger country. When Nelson Mandela launched the Elders, he said that that distinguished group of world statesmen stood because they understood that we're human only through our humanity of others, our connection with others, that we're intricately connected in order for generations to thrive and survive. Our goal is to continue to strengthen that web of connections and protect the solidarity between and among generations. And now my valued and dear colleague, Hilary Pennington, is going to tell you a little bit more about the actual report and the recommendations. So thank you.
Well, just to ditto the thanks to Donna and to Jaya and the phenomenal organization at Generations United. It really has been an incredible pleasure working together. And you all are real troopers. You're the hardcore here. And you probably are here because you are already working on these issues. I know many of you are. And hopefully today will be a chance for all of us, since it is a small gathering, to push our thinking and to think together about how to advance action and innovation on the kinds of issues that we're here to talk about. So just picking up, I am half South African, and I have been thinking about this day and Nelson Mandela, as Donna mentioned as well. And you know, when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize 20 years ago, he also said, "Let it never be said by future generations that indifference, cynicism, or selfishness made us fail to live up to the ideals of humanity," which the Nobel Prize encapsulates. And I think his life and his example is something that we are lucky to have kind of surrounding the events of this day. And we hope that with this report, out of many one, Uniting the Changing Faces of America, we can begin to accelerate a feeling of urgency about the challenges and opportunities that we face as a country, because I do think that we are in a kind of zero-sum thinking. And some of the work that the Generations Initiative commissioned for this report, which is looking at kind of the underlying frameworks and mental models that people use when they think about demographic change. One of the most overriding things that the frameworks people who did that work took away was, as they went out to do sort of person on the street interviews and focus groups, an overwhelming sense of sort of doom and gloom, that people have lost their sense of pragmatism, of the fact that Americans traditionally are people who innovate when faced by problems, and already are far down the road of sort of accepting the narrative that the country's in decline, all of these big changes are happening to us anyway, and we can't do anything about them. And you know, this report and this event is about doing something about the demographic changes and our diversity, which are one of the greatest assets our country could possibly have at a time when there is no talent to waste. We are a country where people are living longer and healthier lives than in any time before, and have decades to continue giving to society and to work and to all the dimensions of life. And we also are one of the very lucky industrialized countries in the world, which is continuing to grow in its younger population. One of the challenges that we have as we think about out of many one, and I know and hope our panelists will speak to some of this today, is that at the same time as we are changing in terms of the age distribution of the United States, we're also changing in terms of the racial and ethnic distribution. And the two generations look really different from each other. So by and large, because of what our immigration policies and public policies looked like at the beginning of the century and middle of the century, people who are 65 and older are predominantly white, and people who are 20 and younger are predominantly not white. And that is an incredible asset, but it means that we have to really understand all of the ways in which we lift up a common and a shared future. Some of the work that Angela Glover-Blackwell and Manuel Pastor have done, beginning to look at states that have the biggest racial generational gap, the biggest difference in the demographic composition between their older population and their younger, show some of what is not so good, could not be so good about our political future, because those are places, you think, in Arizona and North Carolina, which tend to be very politically fractious, and where investments in social service spending and education investments are on the decline, sharp decline, and there's a very strong correlation. So this report is about lifting up ideas that change that. And I want to just thank the incredible authors. We asked, we took an interesting approach. We asked established policy thinkers and emerging policy thinkers to each take one of 4 topics and write about them. And if we could just have our authors stand up. And Andrew, that's you too. Thank you. Just a huge thanks to all of you. And we have also had a very distinguished advisory group, which we're grateful to. And if you are members of our advisory group could stand up as well. And I think Taylor Joe is in where? Aren't you on our advisory? Thank you. So thanks to all of you. So the report is great, and I urge you to read the detail because the executive summary doesn't do justice to it. Each of these writers took a really creative look at how we got to where we are today, what the federal role is in relationship to each of 4 topics: workforce, housing, transportation, and civic engagement, and have very provocative and I think powerful ideas about how to shift federal policy in a way to encourage more social cohesion and intergenerational balance. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of those recommendations. Our civic engagement report, Shirley Sagawa talks about all the ways in which to use volunteerism to create stronger linkages between generations. And Heather McGee took a different tack and talked about political participation, that civic engagement is beyond service and volunteering, but also has to include how we organize ourselves to participate in the democracy. And each of them have very interesting recommendations there, including the idea of time banks, where people could bank time in order to give and get services. And Heather's idea that unless there is 100% voter participation, perhaps we ought to invalidate elections. So really interesting and provocative ideas in those reports. Similarly, in the housing report, Erica Potig and Anita Hairston talk about how we keep remaking communities and housing stock, and we have to keep updating the ways in which we do that over time. But in addition to kind of thinking about the balance between ownership and rental housing, to also think about creative ideas like whether there could be some kind of home sharing where younger people get reductions in their college loans in exchange for helping people age in place. And finally, I'm running out of time, so I'll just do the workforce chapter, and then you all will have to read the transportation one yourselves. But Tony Carnevale and Andrew and his colleagues sort of refute the notion that we're in a zero-sum game and that older people staying in the workforce longer cannibalizes opportunity for young people. But then they go on to say that we all have an interest in better and more effective employment, and we ought to be thinking that the ways in which we think about work we should challenge, because we're going to need slower off-ramps for people who are older, but much faster and more aggressive on-ramps for young people. And Aaron Smith from Young Invincibles has a fascinating chapter in which he calls for a way to rethink some of our time-honored traditions and update them like apprenticeships for the future. So you need to read the report. There's a lot of powerful words in it, but I am very fortunate in passing the baton to introduce Maria Urbina. She has worked for Senator Harry Reid for 5 years, and she serves as his legislative correspondence manager. And she's with us today because she is a proud alumnus of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Public Policy Fellowship Program, and a wonderful example of the rising leaders in this country who will make a difference on these issues. And she also exemplifies the importance of intergenerational civic engagement, which we highlight in the report. Her local Rotary Club sponsored her by raising money so that she could apply for college, and she went on to graduate from the University of Nevada, where she majored in political science and journalism. And please join me in welcoming Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. Good morning. So I was a 15-year-old kid who wore way too much pink when I met this lady who had a Subaru and a bumper sticker that read, "Think globally, act locally." And since then, my life has been forever changed by a loving and creative mentor. I met Debbie, AKA my soul mama, more than a decade ago at a youth leadership conference in Lake Tahoe, where young people from across Nevada gathered to exchange ideas about ways to better our communities through service learning projects. She was the facilitator and I the attendee. Through the years, however, Deb helped me navigate spaces unfamiliar to me and my folks. My parents, who labor in factories back home in Nevada, laid a strong foundation for hard work, love of family, and a spirit of humility. But I needed guidance and support to reach higher education and professional opportunities, or simply asking an older woman her thoughts on falling in love, hyphenating her last name, and motherhood. And it is in this spirit that I have tried to remain rooted in service, fellowship, and human connections. 5 years ago, I was part of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, CHCI, Public Policy Fellowship Program, which offers recently graduated Latinos a chance at national level experience in public policy. In addition to serving as a catalyst for many young Latinos into the federal workforce, CHCI serves as a professional hub for professional development, offering Friday sessions where experienced workers share their insights about work in advocacy, policy, law, corporate, and government affairs. These Friday sessions provided meaningful spaces for dialogue, creativity, and reflection about stepping into our dreams and making lasting impacts in our fields and our communities. That is why early in my Senate career, I joined the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association, CHASA. CHASA, in similar ways, fosters a community of Hill staffers who are committed to increasing diversity in Congress and helping the next generation of Hispanics on the Hill. One example in which CHASA offers guidance and mentorship is by hosting a Trailblazer series that demystifies the careers of prominent leaders and thinkers and helps its members realize their own paths to success. One of my favorite Trailblazers was Undersecretary Maria Otero, who served with Secretary Clinton and oversaw U.S. foreign policy related to civilian security, democracy, and human rights. Otero was the first Latina undersecretary in its history. Yeah, there she was, splitting a box of pepperoni pizza with a bunch of 20-somethings, talking about her story when she came from Bolivia as a young girl. That's the thing about mentorships. They can last a decade or the lunch hour, but their impact is enduring. These relationships and conversations have stayed with me, and I hope to learn from them as I develop and grow into my own work in policy. Deb, the bumper sticker lady with the Subaru, she's still in my life today and continues to amaze me through her passion for building communities, nurturing young people, and empowering women from Virginia City to Latin America. Thank you.
Maria, your story inspires us, and we thank you for embodying strong community values. Next, I'm pleased to introduce Ron Brownstein, Atlantic Media's editorial director for strategic partnerships, and who's also in charge of their long-term editorial strategy. A few words on Ron. This is Ron's first time moderating our panel for us, and we are honored that he was willing to join us today and participate in this program. In his editorials, Ron, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, offers his probing and sobering insight on how the changing demographics reshape policies and politics. In his 2011 election coverage, examined how rising minority populations contributed to President Obama's election victory. In 2012, editorial for The Atlantic, Ron shed light on the 3/5 Hispanic and African Americans who still feel optimistic about the American dream. Among his journalism honors are the Journalist of the Year Award from the Los Angeles Press Club in 2005 and the Carrie McWilliam Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Political Science Association. Ron, welcome, and thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Walter. And as you heard from Donna and Hillary, we are here to talk about the new Generations United and Generations Initiative report, out of many, one, Uniting the Changing Faces of America. And as you heard, the report looks at the ways these demographic changes can potentially catalyze opportunities for all generations, offers some ideas to try to get to that place, but also acknowledges some of the challenges we face in making this a win-win change as opposed to one that engenders more conflict. As Hillary noted, we are living through two profound demographic changes simultaneously. We are both diversifying and aging. The projections are that our under 18 population will be majority non-white, not in 2040, not in 2030, but in this decade. Meanwhile, because there was essentially no immigration between 1924 and 1965, our current generation of seniors is roughly 80% white, and we know that number is projected to decline very slowly, even as the number of seniors roughly doubles over the next quarter century. So there is great opportunity in these developments, but also the risk of sustained political conflict. And we want to talk about both ends of that equation here in the next few minutes. In the small house plug department, I would just alert you that at National Journal, we are trying to systematically explore these issues through our Next America project, and that is available. You can find that on our homepage at National Journal, where we're looking at many of the same questions that you are grappling with in this report. So to discuss the report and some of the broader issues that it raises, we really have a terrific panel here this morning that I am privileged to moderate. And very quickly, let me introduce them as they are getting wired and can't respond. That's a very good point to be introducing. Angela Glover Blackwell is the founder and chief executive officer of PolicyLink, which is a leading organization in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for low-income people and communities of color. She has been a leading voice and featured in the nation's top news organizations, from the New York Times and the Washington Post to CNN and Nightline. Gene Sturley is the Richard B. Fisher Chair at the Urban Institute, author of a column and blog, The Government We Deserve. His forthcoming book, Dead Men Ruling, suggests that we live in a time of opportunity, not austerity, but are bound by decades of both parties seeking to control, not enable the future. Sounds fascinating. Vanessa Cardenas is the vice president of Progress 2050 at the Center for American Progress, which as of today may have some more openings in the upper leadership, where she focuses on the intersection of policy and race with expertise on immigration, demographic change, and issues relevant to the growing Latino community in the U.S. She was profiled as one of 100 people to watch in the next century by Washingtonian magazine. She's a regular guest on CNN en Espanol, Telemundo, Univision, and BBC. And finally, Bill Fry, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, an internationally regarded demographer, quoted frequently in the National Journal, and he has authored over 200 publications and several books, including one to be released this spring, Diversity Explosion: How New Racial Demographics is Remaking America. So let me move over and join you now. This out of the way. Thank you, all of you, for being here and for adding your, your distinct angles and expertise to this conversation. The report, as you heard, argues that our demographic diversity in both age and race is our greatest asset, that we benefit both from an influx of younger workers, especially as compared to other industrialized countries, and also from, quote, the long expertise and experience of older workers. So let me ask you to start. Do you agree that both of these developments, the diversifying and the aging, are advantages to our society? And if so, are we on track to maximize the benefits they could produce? Angela?
I absolutely agree that they are assets and they could make a real difference going forward. I don't think we're on track. But the polling, both the polling that's being released today and polling that we've done with the Center for American Progress and the Rockefeller Foundation for All in Nation, suggests that the American people desperately want to see that path opened up. I'm not sure why it is that our public officials cannot keep up with their constituency. But the constituency clearly sees the change, they're comfortable with the change, and they're comfortable with a policy environment that create a pathway to a bright future. But we're not on that pathway yet.
Gene?
I agree. I think it's actually a time of extraordinary opportunity. You know, some people try to define this age as one of austerity, which I think is totally wrong. We're richer than we've ever been. The fact that we're only growing 2% a year instead of 4% doesn't mean we're poor. It just means we're growing at a slower rate. We have extraordinary opportunities before us, and I think the demographic changes actually play into that. They give us a chance to play to our advantages. It's not that every demographic shift is necessarily positive or negative in and of itself, but it always provides an opportunity. But are we on the path to take care of it? I'd say not. We're basically fighting old battles. I think we're fighting battles from 50 years ago still in our political system on both sides. And particularly with respect to these demographics, I think of the elderly or the older population being to the first half of the 21st century what women were to the last half of the 20th century, basically the largest pool of underutilized talent we have in this economy. We're not using it.
Let's come back to that. Vanessa, what's your overview?
Totally an asset, and first of all, thanks for being here. I think both the changes that we're discussing today are an asset. I think when you talk about communities of color, a lot of the conversation is very focused on the challenges, which while important, we really need to have a conversation about innovation, about human capital, about entrepreneurship that we're not having, and in that sense, I really think it's an asset. And when we talk about baby boomers, you know, we have to understand that the American dream as we know it was built in many ways by the baby boomers. So we sort of, you know, made those investments to create a ladder of opportunity that, yes, left people behind, and now we have an opportunity to really reinvest and create a ladder of opportunity for the next generation of Americans. So I think they are both an asset.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, first of all, I want to congratulate Generations United and the Generations Initiative for really putting a spotlight on what I see to be a really important demographic fact of life. We're really, people say demography is destiny. It's never been more destiny than it is right now. And when we see these younger people, what I call new minorities, Hispanics and Asians, as well as the other minorities, African Americans and others, it's a real gift for us. The fact that we had this immigration, big numbers between the late 80s and the early aughts, has given us the opportunity to build a labor force, to build a future which would be very unsuccessful if we were in the European situation, many of those countries seeing a decline in their labor force populations. We're actually going to see growth totally because of these new minorities. But as a lot of people have said here, we need to invest in them. And I think an initiative like this, which puts a spotlight on the fact that these demographics are just so important and that people come to realize that, is what's really going to help this come about.
You know, I think the phrase I often use at the 2012 election was a rock through the window that showed people that politically we are living in a different country, in the sense that Mitt Romney won a higher share of the vote among whites than Ronald Reagan did in 1980, and he lost by 5 million votes. So people kind of recognize that politics has changed because of the changing demography of the country. There's kind of less awareness, I think, that everything else has changed, that the workforce is changing, schools are changing, the communities are changing. This report has a series of recommendations to try to put us on a track toward better outcomes here. Angel, as you kind of look through it, what did you think would have the biggest bang for the buck in what they're talking about? What would make the biggest impact of the ideas that are considered here?
Well, I love that phrase, a rock through the window. Thank you for that. I actually was very interested in the transportation and the housing, because they're both so fundamental for connecting to opportunity, connecting to civic life, connecting to family members. And I think that young people and older people have so much in common in those two areas. And so I really liked the way that they were both lifted up in terms of needing to have access that is affordable, being able to have flexibility in terms of housing choice, and thinking hard about how to be able to make transportation the connector that it can be. Older people and younger people absolutely have much in common in those two arenas.
Gene, anything you thought that had the most impact?
What I liked was the flavor of the report. Again, like everyone else, I really want to congratulate the initiative and Generations United and what they've done. But I like the flavor of just thinking past where we're at. You know, the numbers I run say, you know, our economy's growing. You know, 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, we're going to double in size. We're going to have a lot more resources. Let's think about how to allocate them. And that's what this report does. It says, let's think imaginatively. We're not stuck in the past.
We come right back to that. But Vanessa?
Sure. Well, I'm very excited about the civic participation chapter. I think that's incredibly important to our communities when we're talking about driving the change and making sure that we're electing leaders that really reflect our interests and our policy ideas and wishes. I also want to go back to a statistic that we heard a lot about in 2012 was the fact that 12 million Latino voters turned out to vote, and that was like a really huge mark for us. Yet what people don't talk about is the fact there are at least 10 to 11 million Latinos who are eligible but did not vote. So I think when you talk about the potential there in terms of voters, in terms of engaging communities, is huge, and that's why I was really excited about the civic participation recommendation.
I think the employment chapter had a lot of very good recommendations. Again, we're aiming toward the future, getting these young generations ready for jobs in the new economy, and all of the things about having the kind of training that links to the employment opportunities that are out there, I think are really very important.
So, Jean, you know, as several have mentioned, and Hillary and Donna mentioned, the kind of the underlying theme of the report, the central thread, is finding ways to harmonize the interests of these two giant generations. I mean, the heavily diverse millennial generation, the predominantly white baby boom generation. I want to talk a little bit about the choices that we are making now in public policy, because the Urban Institute certainly has been at the forefront of analyzing the generational implications of the federal budget. And among your conclusions was that in 1960, kids and seniors each consumed 1/5 of federal domestic spending. Now the share for seniors is triple the share for kids, and the number that that has really gotten the most attention is that per capita, the federal government spends about $7 on seniors for each dollar it spends on kids. How have we, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's ever been a moment where we said, okay, let's tilt it in that direction. How have we gotten there, and does that have to be rebalanced?
So I think rebalancing is necessary, but I want to be clear again. I keep pointing to the fact that we're a growing economy, partly for the reasons Bill and others have mentioned. But we're a growing economy. We're very lucky. We've always had a strong promotion of the labor force in this economy, vis-a-vis even a lot of other economies. So that growth provides extraordinary potential. So the trick is you don't necessarily have to cut back on what you did in the past, but you have to try to figure out how to orient that growth to where needs are greatest. 20th century, the needs of the elderly were extraordinary. We did a remarkably good job, I wouldn't say necessarily recently, but throughout most of that century, in really improving the well-being of the elderly. I say not necessarily recently because we're spending tens of billions or more on elderly programs now without really having much impact on poverty. We're not even orienting that money to them in a way that I think is very good. So it's just a matter of capturing that growth and start orienting it to making, in my view, the 21st century, the century of the child, the way we made the 20th century, the century for the elderly.
But just to follow up, are you saying you can do that, you can capture the growth and kind of shift this balance without changing the trajectory of growth for the entitlement program?
No. I mean,
as the number of seniors are doubling, right?
That's right. The president's own budget, President Obama's own budget said in 10 years, 11 years, we'll spend $1.2 trillion more. That's what he proposed. Of that $1.2 trillion, $800 billion went for basically Social Security, Medicare, and Medicare, excluding children. $400 billion went for more interest on the debt because we're not raising enough taxes to pay our way, and nothing went to anything else. That was not just children, but it was the middle-aged people as well.
Well, I just wanted to add that I think that this zero-sum game approach is very negative, and where we have to really bring the spotlight on is the fact that if we actually will improve the outcomes of people of color and people that really need it, we would actually benefit our economy, right? And in the book that Policy Link and CAP published, All in Nation, we talked about what happens if we actually close racial gaps in income in 2011, and what happens is you would have more GDP, you will lift 13 million people out of poverty, you would have more taxes. So these policies that we talk about in terms of closing racial gaps would actually help us and empower us and give us, everybody will be better off. So I think it's important to have a conversation about how much we're spending today, but really recognize that by closing racial gaps will actually benefit everyone.
And there'd be a bigger pie to then allocate resources from. Do you see, I mean, as there's no question that the balance in the federal budget, post-Medicare, post-Medicaid, has tilted, and also with demographic change, has tilted away from kids toward seniors. Is that ultimately the choice, or are there other dimensions to it, in your view?
Well, I just want to agree with the point that we are not a poor country and we need to stop acting like one. And every time we force ourselves into a conversation about shall we invest in this or that, we're feeding into this notion that we don't have enough to achieve the goals that will help the country to be strong and provide for all. We need to get out of that mindset. And we need to actually step back and ask about the policies that help us become strong. When you talk about what's happened in terms of the politics in the last 2 elections, yes, that reflects the shifting demographic, but it also reflects people growing in numbers who have some sense of generosity, accountability to the other, attracted by policies that invest in education and transportation and housing. I actually think that we have an amazing opportunity to have a conversation about what do we need. And when we do that, we'll see that yes, the elderly need to be supported, children absolutely need to be supported, and people in the middle who have responsibility for families need to have access. If we would create a strong economy based on the assets that we have, we would generate even more support for a government to be able to actually step up and be a government for all the people.
Let me come back to that in 1 minute, because I think that is at the core of the political debate that we're facing, how you do that. But Bill, let me ask you about kind of because you've looked at this pretty carefully. You talk about the cultural generation gap. I've talked about the brown and the gray as kind of a variant on that. The poll, this online poll that was done as part of this, did find a generally positive response to the changing demographics. More than 1/3 reported positive feelings about the changes. Less than 10% reported negative feelings. About half, just over half, were neutral. But other polls have found more anxiety. Pew polling, our polling, have found that if you ask, is the immigration that we're living through revitalizing the society or basically undermining, changing too fast and threatening American values, you find the overall majority saying it's a good thing, but whites split exactly 50-50, and older whites in particular being a lot of them expressing unease. You've looked at this. How do you kind of sort through the various strands of American reaction to what is undeniably a very profound wave of change?
Well, it's difficult, and it depends on, I guess, what you're tapping into. I, in fact, was surprised by this poll, given all of what you just said, which are a lot of the polls from Pew Research, from National Journal, and other places that show some very sharp distinctions, particularly among whites worried about taxes in some of those polls, big government, except for Social Security.
Right.
Not a real surprise. And of course, the younger and more minority population, and opening the social safety net and all kinds of things like that. But I think this is a good omen that there's a poll like this, and that there's a big part of the population, depending on how the question is asked, is at least neutral about it. Now, within that neutral category, the way I read some of these numbers, it's the older people and the younger people that seem to be more favorable for doing something. That question about we're not against targeting particular groups for K-12 versus the senior programs is not something either group thinks is a burden for them, but it's an investment. It's getting those people in the Middle Ages probably to come around is probably the more difficult thing to do. And it also differs in the different parts of the country. And I think that one of the things that I think that investment in just getting this message out and getting people on the ground talking about are in those parts of the country where this diversity change is just happening.
Right.
And I think, you know, if you did a poll and looked at those kinds of places, you could change people's minds in those places. And I think that's really where we need to go.
Let's stick there for a second. Talk about that, and I'm not going to bring in everyone else, but talk about just the phenomena there. Because one of the things we're seeing is not only a deepening, but a broadening of this change. I think about half the states, Hispanics were at least 40% of the population gain in the first decade of the century. What's happening, and what is the reaction that we're seeing when diversity comes to places that had not previously experienced it?
Yeah, well, what is happening is right now we have in 22 states, minorities are at least 40% of the child population. So that's the future in like half the state, and that includes California, New York, the big states, as well as the other states. But they're moving into the Southeast, they're moving into the Mountain West. We can see that in the politics and the way some of the states that Obama won, largely because of minorities in some of those places. And I think those are the places, at least initially, you see a lot more of the pushback. Arizona is a good example of a place, even though it has a high minority population, that growth is fairly recent in the last 2 years, or the last 2 decades. And you see the pushback to the Proposition 1070 among the older whites, among the minorities versus the older whites in terms of different views on that. And in terms of some of these states are coming out with voter ID that seem to be punitive against minorities, tend to be in those states where there's not a lot of minority population, but the growth is fairly recent. So I think that's where the opportunities are for civic leaders, not to try to fan the flames of these kinds of, polarizing kinds of political issues, but to explain to people the kinds of things that we're talking about.
Vanessa, you guys do a lot of grassroots work. Talk about the impact as places diversify.
Actually,
what I thought was interesting on the poll, and this relates to your point, Bill, is that 60% of respondents thought that local communities were better at sort of facilitating this change. And I think that's really where the conversation is happening. Yes, you have the Arizonas of the world that are sort of in shock about what's happening in terms of immigration, the changing demographics, but once they get over that, they're having a local conversation about what this means for the future. And when you look at your schools and you see that the majority of kids there are kids of color, and you start thinking about the fact that in a few years you're going to retire and you're going to need someone who's young and of color to buy your home, you start making the connections that you need to invest in these communities. So while there are some tensions and we cannot, gloss them over, I think that local communities are having these conversations. But what we need is leaders, elected leaders, to actually help really get this conversation going and oriented in the right way.
And everyone on this panel at various points have made the argument that there is, in fact, more commonality of interest than the politics now allows, in the sense that, as you say, unless you move more of these young African-American and Hispanic kids into the middle class, it's not clear who's going to pay the payroll taxes to fund Social Security and Medicare for this giant generation moving into retirement. But I think, as you also suggested, the politics today doesn't really flow toward that conclusion. It is often presented more as a conflict in resources. And I just thought about that, what it would take to kind of create more of that bridge.
We actually at PolicyLink work in communities all across the country. And we are seeing that in local communities, people are working together more than you get the sense if you just look at the national news. Leaders, grassroots organizers, parents, they're all coming together and trying to make their communities work better. They need their schools, their transportation systems, their civic environment to work better, and they're finding each other in ways that are quite extraordinary. I think we're at one of those moments in which our private values are ahead of our public values. People in their private lives are ready to move forward, but our leaders and our politicians and our government policies haven't caught up. What do we need to do to make them catch up? Well, first we need to deal with the reality. We are not talking enough about the shifting demographics. It's still too isolated a conversation. People need to know that what they see happening around them is happening, it is inevitable, it is a good thing. We need to name those assets. We need to start finding policies the way this initiative is pointing out that actually appeal to everyone, and there are so many that do. Not only are these good policies across generations, these are good policies across rural and urban, they're good policies across Latino, African American, white, and so we need to lift that up for the American people. This is a moment for leadership, and our political leadership is missing the moment.
You know, Gene, because certainly the debate now is framed in you have a very stark racial divide in voting. As I mentioned, Mitt Romney won 59% of whites. Over 60% of whites over 45 voted against President Obama. 4/5 of the House Republicans are in districts that are more white than the national average. 2/3 of the House Democrats in districts that are more non-white than the national average. And the budget fights, even if race is not directly mentioned, often seems like an undercurrent, in some ways back to the thematics of the 1980s in terms of transfer payments and that sort of thing. So how do you escape that kind of future of just kind of systemic conflict along economic, with a racial and economic kind of overlay to it?
So I went to a conference at Catholic Charities where somebody made a brilliant remark, I thought. He said, the prophets of old did two things. They said this world can continue, but they gave you hope for the future. The problem right now is the debate is about this world can continue. And I think the public doesn't know what to do with that, because that's not telling them why you want to move onward. And so like this panel, we're talking about the opportunities we see before us for educating the young more, for investing more in our people, for investing more in the elderly, particularly taking advantage of their work skills and things like that. So that's the opportunity. That's not the debate we're having. The debate we're trapped in is that the system is so overpromised now that is unlike all of our history until very recently, the future's captured. All future revenues are already pre-committed and more than that. It'd be like a company, IBM or Microsoft, saying we think we're going to double or triple in size in 20 or 30 years, and we're now to buy all the plant and equipment today that we need 30 years from now. We have to restore the discretion to the budget so that we can allow these opportunities to be taken advantage of.
So when you say it's overpromised, what is the piece that has to be?
So the politicians are fighting. When an overpromised system, the trap for the politician is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you've got to renege on a promise. And as soon as you renege on that promise, we, the voters, kill them. That's the trap we're in right now. And the way out of the trap, the only way I see out of the trap is actually to push on this opportunity agenda. The reason we have to come together, stop overcommitting the future, is to restore that discretion that we can really invest in it.
When
It's
you
almost
say-
like to
when-
enable the future, we can't control
When
it.
you're saying we're overpromising and we've overcommitted the future, what specifically are you talking about? What is locking us in that way?
So the health and retirement programs grow forever faster than the economy, absorbing more than their share of resources, and taxes are kept too low to pay our bills. And that's the fault on both sides. That's the promise both sides have made for the future, that whatever's promised for the future, we don't debate whether we're going to keep Social Security or Medicare at current levels. We're debating whether a 5% growth could be 4%, and then whether it's Obama or Romney, they both said they were going to cut back on Medicare, and they both attacked each other as saying, well, you're only going to let the system grow by 4% instead of 5%.
Right.
It's that type of promise on the title side. On the tax side, we don't even collect enough to pay our bills.
So Vanessa, I mean, we talk about, I mean, what is the case you could make in a blue-collar, heavily white rural district now represented by a Republican, in which the dominant view is federal spending is, too much of it is wasted, too much of it is a transfer payment to people who don't deserve it. What's the argument that could ultimately create a political consensus in a place like that for more investment in the people you want to see?
I think the argument is that that the investments that we're talking about, whether it's preschool access, whether it's an increase in minimum wage, whether it's better college access, benefits everyone, whether you are black, white, blue collar, or or working poor. The agenda that we're proposing really benefits everybody, and I think we are not communicating that very clearly. I also, and that's when we talked about, the equity agenda benefits you, whether it's not just about race and it's not just about class, it's about both of them. And I think the president in his recent speech on inequality was exactly right? Our greatest challenge moving forward is inequality, and it doesn't matter where you come from, you need to be worried about that and worry about the lack of opportunities that we have today and in the future. And in order for all of us, to come together and overcome that, we really have to embrace this agenda of equity and really closing the challenges that we face.
Before we go to questions, Angela, same question. How would you make the case in a place that is now where the politics are driven by skepticism of government spending, that there is an argument to be made for expanding investment in some of these areas?
I would really talk to people about the things that are important to them. People need to have really good wages to support their family. We need to make sure that the floor is a decent floor. We need to raise the minimum wage and go well beyond that. I would talk to them about what their children will need to be able to stay in their communities, that they need to be well educated, but you need to have jobs in the community, and we need for government to help us be innovators, to be able to help young people have the skills that they need. We need to tap the entrepreneurial spirit that is at the heart of this nation and make sure that we're including people in. I would help people see that if we could stop fighting over things like health care and the basics, that we could then really start to have the steps and platforms and ladders that lead up to full economic opportunity. I think that people would nod as I say that. And then I would say, and the new Latinos in your community, the African American families that have been on the outskirts, the people who are aging in your community, all need the same thing. First, talk about what people want, show them the government policies that will get there, and then tell them this is exactly what those who you feel are different want. We are of one mind about what we need.
And that is the challenge. All right, let's go bring in the audience with some questions, if we have any. Over here.
My name is Michael Marcus, I'm a board member of Generations United. I have a brief statement, and then I want to ask a question. The statement is that we need to remember that once we deduct the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, other things, actual real spending on older adults and on kids has declined over the last decade. So to continue to say, well, there's so much more spending on older adults and kids is in some ways a misnomer. And that without Social Security, we then see the impact of that kind of spending falling back on principally low-income families. We need to be really protective of them. The question is, would someone address the potential impact of new technologies on creating one out of many? How do new technologies affect these sorts of initiatives?
We actually At a release of All In Nation in Oakland where we talked about the technology economy and what it meant given the shift in demographics. And it was a very interesting discussion because there were in fact tensions. Some of the new technologies are very threatening to employment, very threatening to the growth of jobs as technology replaces people in some ways. But we expanded that conversation to talk about how that's really a myth, how that really is not what's happening. And we looked at programs that are getting young people of color into technology at early ages. And we talked to investors who actually were talking about how for the technological explosion to continue, it desperately needs the creativity that people of color, particularly because they are the young people, will bring to that. So there's a real coming together around it, but there are tensions.
So, is there another question? Or anybody else want to respond to that? Yes.
Talking about reductions in benefits for older Americans. It seems to me that's the equation you set up.
Well, more taxes.
That's the way the politicians would have you define it. Ron knows this even better than I do, but the name of the game in Washington or in state capitals is to go to constituents, and especially constituents in your party or in your interest group, and say, you know, those people don't care about you. They don't really realize what you're entitled to. And then you define the baseline as high as you can. Whatever you think you're entitled to. You think you're not entitled not to pay estate taxes, that's the baseline. You think you're entitled to this growth in Medicare of 5% a year, that's what you're entitled to. When for decades now, the actuaries have said these systems are imbalanced and they can't maintain the growth that they've got. That is, they're growing faster than the economy. So that's not really taking away from people. It's basically saying there's just going to be a lower growth rate. If you would redefine, you're going to get, you middle-aged people are going to get $10,000 more in Medicare benefits, but not $15,000, you probably wouldn't be offended. But if I go to you and say, boy, your Medicare benefits are going to be cut, which is the way the interest groups would define it, then people attack it. So what I'm trying to point out is this growth, which technology also makes possible. If we get this growth in the economy, these are mutually reinforcing issues. We get this growth in the economy, it provides enormous resources, and we just have to reallocate them. The total spending of government right now, counting state and local, federal, and tax subsidies, is $55,000 a household. That's more than the average income of a household in the early 1960s, and it's growing. We are a rich nation who's capable of doing a great many things. We just have to make some choices.
You know, Bill, I've been struck, maybe to follow up on that, watching the debate over the healthcare law. It's showing the difficulty of a politics that promotes generational compact. First, the healthcare law was attacked in the 2012 campaign, and the Romney campaign attacked it for taking money from the growth of Medicare and using that to fund insurance for the working age uninsured, in effect for taking money down the generational ladder. Now, more recently, it's being attacked in the opposite direction, basically arguing that young people are being asked to pay too much in premiums, the uninsured, who are being brought into the system to cover, and, to bring down costs for people who are older. So there's actually, generational rebalancing going in both directions, and each one has been attacked rather than arguing it's some sort of overall new compact, in which things flow in both directions. And I'm just kind of struck that this is a perfect little example of how difficult it is in our political system now to make the argument of commonality among generations.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's, as you say, there's some geographical aspect to all of this because of all of those largely white Republican districts are going to take one kind of argument, and the urbanized, more diverse areas are going to take another kind of argument. The only thing I'm thinking about in this political stuff from a demographer standpoint, and if you look at the eligible voters in the 2012 election, was about 28% minority, 28 or so percent minority. It'll probably be 31% in 2016. In 28, it's going to be 40% the way I've calculated them. Now, when you think about in 1968 when the civil rights bills were put together, the minority population, the largely black minority population, was only 15% of the U.S. population. When you have minorities that are 40% of eligible voters, which is 14 years from now, but is still not too far in the future, you're going to have a different kind of conversation for both parties. I don't think you're going to have a white Republican Party and a minority Democratic Party. Both parties are going to have to come to grips with some of these issues. Maybe not in the most rural parts of the hinterland, but in a broader spectrum of the population than we see today. Now that's long term, but I think we're going to get there.
Can I just say something?
Sure,
You
Vanessa.
sort of see that in the immigration debate right now, right? And sort of the way the immigration movement is really pushing Republicans to actually bring a bill to the House, right? And Speaker Boehner can only close his doors for so long. I mean, I don't know if you've been following the debate, but the advocates have been trying to meet with him and ask him to bring this bill to the floor, and he keeps on closing his doors, his offices all over the place. But I think the point is that the more communities of color organize to really push forward their agenda, the more they're going to demand of their elected officials. But we have to remind ourselves that the policies that we are advocating and the policies that are laid out in this report are actually will benefit everyone. And we just sort of, the political class, and especially those that are not supportive of a progressive agenda, need to recognize that they can no longer sort of not consider the voters of the future.
All right, thank you. So Brittany Johnson, who was supposed to be here, is unable to join us today due to the weather, but we are pleased that Taylor Jo Eisenberg of the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network will be sharing her story. And the panel, you are free to go, or unless you want us to sit through. Yeah, you are dismissed. Join me in thanking this terrific panel. And Taylor Jo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So I am a poor substitute for Brittany Johnson, and I'm actually going to be sharing a little bit about her story with you guys today. So Brittany Johnson is a member of the Columbia Community Exchange, and she was delayed as she was trying to leave Howard County because of the inclement weather, so she couldn't join us. But both Generations Initiative and Generations United wanted to make sure that the lesson and essence of her story, which you can find in the report, was captured here today. So, as this report speaks to and tries to counter, there is a narrative that's been long developing that the challenges facing our social fabric are too great to overcome. But Brittany's story is one example speaking against that. As a single mom with a 5-year-old at 24 years old, Brittany sought out assistance from the Columbia Community Exchange of Howard County, Maryland, which is a member of the Time Banks USA. She needed help, and she went there to, for those of you familiar with the way Time Banks work, to give her time to receive somebody else's time in return. She worked with older adults, providing them with technological skills, such as setting up printers, and received from them their time for childcare, something that she couldn't afford on her own. And through that experience, she not only got that time in terms of childcare, but was able to get advice that she needed. She ended up meeting a behavioral psychologist who provided feedback and advice on how and childcare for her 5-year-old. As she said, if I hadn't sat down with her and gotten to know what her life was like before she retired, I would not have known that she had the service to offer, Johnson said. And that's one of the things, as a Time Bank member, I still like, getting to know my neighbor for who they really are. A lot of times, civic engagement, whether in the form of community service or investing in younger and older generations as effective, informed, and engaged civic actors in our political process, is treated as the red-headed stepchild in harder policy debates and conversations. But Brittany's story, one that speaks to better outcomes for her child and therefore future generations, of fostered connections and understanding and a sense of purpose among community members, demonstrates how important it is that we don't shy away from investment in the civic capacity of individuals and intergenerational communities on the path to a better future of all.
Ron and panelists, what a powerful exchange. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. And Taylor Jo, thank you for sharing Brittany's story. We really do appreciate you pinch hitting for her. Brittany's remarkable story shows how far decency, caring, and passion for justice can go. Thank you for sharing with us and offering a glimpse into how time banks can build stronger communities by connecting people of all ages together. Out of many, one. Our goal today was to take a look at how demographic diversity, both in age and in race, is our greatest asset. I'd like to once again thank our authors. I'm not going to ask you to stand again, but we do want to give you a round of applause for contributing to our event today. This event has been taped and will be available online soon. The full report and executive summary are available on Generations United's website and Generation Initiative's website. Please share this information widely and encourage this conversation to continue. This is a very important conversation to us. On behalf of the two organizations, we challenge you to join us and think outside the traditional boxes of race and age. Our country has flourished based on the belief, out of many, one. And it will continue to flourish as long as we remember that we are stronger together. Thank you again for joining us. We have refreshments in the back of the room, and we would encourage those that are in attendance today to join us for refreshments so that we can continue this discussion. Have a great day and travel safely.